Good afternoon. We'll start today's program with a message from Beyond Earth co-founder, Steve Wolf.
Good afternoon, and welcome to this first web event hosted by the Beyond Earth Institute, where we will discuss the Artemis Accords and how it could be a model for international protocols for commercial development of space and eventual settlement of outer space. I am Steve Wolf. I'm co-founder of Beyond Earth. I'm also the Deputy Executive Director of SpaceCom. I first have to say that, I'm really blown away by the response to this event. It will be available for viewing afterwards for those who were not able to join us. We have a great program planned with Mike Gold, Pete Worden, and Laura Montgomery, and the Beyond Earth team. But first, I want to get it. Before we get to our guest speakers, I want to tell you a little bit about the Beyond Earth Institute, its history and current context. And for me, the story begins about 30 years ago when I helped to write and pass the Space Settlement Act of 1988. It was a bill authored by the late George E. Brown Jr., a Democrat from California. The bill was signed into law by Ronald Reagan as part of the NASA authorization measure of that year. And essentially, the law acknowledged that space settlement was an eventual and a very positive outcome of our human endeavors in space. It also required that NASA regularly report to Congress on progress being made on technologies that would enable communities beyond Earth. While the advocacy community was obviously very enthusiastic, NASA was less so and rejected the reporting requirement, which was never enforced, and the law was all but forgotten over time. In 1988, perhaps we were not ready to take seriously policies that would enable communities beyond Earth. But times are much different now. The past decade has seen a rapid expansion of commercial space activities driven by a dramatic reduction in launch costs. We are entering a Moore's Law phase of space transportation in terms of cost reduction and reliability improvements. This will not only drive the market for more sophisticated and readily replaceable satellite systems, but also it will ignite the market for human space travel. At the dawn of this rapid expansion of capability, the giants of the new space age, Musk, Bezos, and Branson, have unabashedly stated their intention to help humanity become multi-planet species. This view is held publicly and privately by many throughout the space community and the general public, and I suspect many of you are watching right now. At the press conference following the historic launch of Falcon 9 that ferried American astronauts to the International Space Station, Elon Musk stated, to extend life beyond Earth, we are life's agent in this regard. All creatures and plants that exist here on Earth, we can bring them to other planets. And it's very important that we do so as soon as possible while the window of opportunity is open. I couldn't agree more with Elon. If we are the agents, if we are the agents who will extend life beyond Earth, then we must look upon this role as an obligation to be fulfilled. It is in the spirit and level of commitment that the founders of Beyond Earth have come together to create a unique policy think tank that is devoting its time and resources to creating and sustaining a legal and policy framework that enables equitable opportunities for all interested humans to live in vibrant communities beyond Earth. We are conducting a deep research and analysis and making visionary policy recommendations. We are engaging the universe of stakeholders who will one day bring the vision to reality, and we are educating policymakers in the US and around the world on the importance of adopting our policy recommendations. To those of you who may think that Beyond Earth is a little ahead of its time, we would say that we are playing catch up. we are at the cusp of human expansion into space, and our space policy apparatus is really unprepared. In 1988, it was interesting to consider space settlement policy. Today, it is imperative that we do so. After today's program, I'll speak a little bit more about how you can join this effort. I would now like to turn this program over and to get us started to Tom Marotta. He is Beyond Earth co-founder and senior analyst at the FAA Office of Space Transportation. Tom was a Foreign Service officer for the U.S. Department of State, serving in West Africa, Iraq, and Europe. He is also a co-author of the award-winning book, The High Frontier, An Easier Way. Tom will give a brief overview of the Beyond Earth paper, Policy Recommendations to Accelerate the Establishment of Communities in Space. Tom was lead researcher and writer on this study. And with that, Tom, I'll turn the program over to you.
Great, thank you, Steve. And thank you all for attending this important event today. I'd just like to reiterate that if people are trying to contact you to get into the web event here today, it is being recorded and we will have a live stream available publicly afterwards. As Steve said, my name is Tom Marotta. I'm a co-founder of the Beyond Earth Institute. In addition to this webinar, last month, BE published a paper titled Policy Recommendations to Accelerate the Establishment of Communities in Space. This paper is available at our website, beyondearth.org, under the Policy Resources tab. I'm going to take a few moments to walk us through the basics of the paper, including its recommendations. Before I do that, however, I want to reiterate that this organization, the Beyond Earth Institute, we look towards the future not with cynicism or not with excessive optimism either, but rather we use a sober, data-driven, nonpartisan perspective. Using this approach, I can say that I'm excited about the future, which is coming faster than ever, but I'm also humbled by the incredible amount of work still left to be done. With that said, let's turn to the paper. By now, you've probably had a chance to find it on our website and follow along if you like. The paper is based on a series of interviews. That is, BE interviewed 7 space policy thought leaders and in late 2019 and early 2020. 2 of those people are with us here today, Pete Worden and Laura Montgomery, and we'll hear more from them in a moment here. The space policy thought leaders we interviewed represent a cross-section of industry experts, government representatives, academia, and we asked them essentially what laws, policies, treaties, regulations, what needs to change, and what laws need to be created in order to enable and facilitate humanity's transition to becoming a spacefaring, multiplanetary species. During this process, BE received a wide range of diverse responses. I mean, we got feedback that was all over the map. Extracting a common set of actionable recommendations was difficult, but we were able to come to 3 conclusions that are shared by all of the respondents. First, the United States government must revamp the current arms and export control regimes. These rules are not only ineffective, that is, our adversaries continue to rapidly develop advanced missile programs in spite of ITAR, but they are also counterproductive. They impede the vibrant US commercial space sector from cooperating with like-minded organizations on projects that can advance the development of communities in space. Instead, BE recommends the US government permit more cooperation and cross-border investment with trusted allies. Second, the international aerospace industry should develop voluntary norms of behavior surrounding commercial activities in space in order to attempt to prevent conflicts, improve customer confidence, and decrease investment risk. Industry should not wait for governments to create these types of laws, as in many cases, government action may not be needed. We see on Earth many industries effectively self-regulate to a significant extent. For example, in the US, film industry standards are monitored by the Motion Picture Association of America. There's nothing to lose and everything to gain if industry today lays out rules of the road surrounding, say, lander safety zone dimensions, or granting a right to breathable oxygen for the every resident of a space station. Third recommendation, the United States should establish a whole of government agreement with like-minded allies focused on the eventual establishment of communities in space. This would not be a Kennedy-esque speech demanding a city on the moon or Mars by a certain date. Rather, it might instead be an agreement of principles or a treaty of shared priorities that facilitates the development of a commercial economy in orbit with the ultimate goal of a sustainable, large-scale, expanding human presence in space. NASA's Artemis Accords may be the first step on the path to such an agreement, and I'm so excited Mike Gold is here today to tell us more about it. So without any further ado, I'll hand the program back over to Steve. Thank you.
Hey, Tom, that was awesome. You know, I think you and the teams had quite a bit of work into that, and our anticipation is this conversation today will look at how the Artemis Accord may dovetail with the findings of that report. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, and I have to thank the thought leaders that agreed to be interviewed for the paper. They gave us a lot of their time and a lot of great feedback. So I encourage everyone watching, when they have a chance to read the paper, there's some excellent analysis in there from those thought leaders. So thank you to them.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thanks again, Tom. So let's move on to our main speaker, if you will, is Mike Gold. Now, Mike is the acting associate administrator, as many of you know, for international and interagency relations for NASA. Mike is also responsible for providing strategic direction to the Office of the General Counsel and supporting NASA's LEO commercialization efforts. Prior to joining NASA, Mike was the vice president for civil space for Maxar Technologies. And in addition, he spent 13 years with Bigelow Aerospace, where he established the company's Washington office and oversaw the launches of Genesis 1 and 2 spacecraft. So with that, Mike, I'll turn it over to you to give us an update on what's going on with the Artemis Accord.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve, and I really appreciate the invitation and the work that you and Tom and the whole organization are doing. Settlement, I think, is a terrific topic and a very justifiable and important goal for all of us. And I do hope that the Artemis Accords set up a foundation for us to pursue activities like that in the future. So I thought what I'd do today is just take you through a little bit what the Artemis Accords are and where we're at in the process, and then look forward to taking questions and going through these things at the panel. So Brett, if we go to, see, you read my mind. He's a pro that we've got Brett running the slides here. The Artemis Accords, and you know what, even before we get to the Artemis Accords, let's take a step back to the International Space Station, which is now celebrating 20 years of continuous human occupancy. I think we all take this for granted, and that there are many people alive today who live in a world where there was never not humans in orbit. And we've learned so much from the ISS technologically, but also diplomatically and legally. And we are going to leverage the Intergovernmental Agreement, which is the legal framework for the International Space Station, for the Gateway, which is the cornerstone to the sustainability of the Artemis program. And because the IGA has done such an excellent job in terms of describing how you can operate a space station, the vast majority of it is very applicable to Gateway. However, where we can't leverage the IGA is as we move forward to other Artemis-related activities. And assuming everyone on the call is probably familiar with Artemis, but just to recap, you know, this is NASA's effort to put the first woman and the next man on the moon by 2024, and to lead both NASA and the world forward to the Loon in both an expeditious as well as a sustainable fashion, to not only develop the Moon and look at settlement of the Moon, but to demonstrate the technologies, the systems, and gain the experience necessary to mount a historic human mission to Mars. So an extremely exciting time at NASA, in the private sector, and throughout the space industry globally. And again, with Gateway, which is an orbital outpost that will be supported by an international coalition around the Moon, we've got a legal framework with Gateway. But as we look at other orbiters and lunar landers, rovers, prospectors, all sorts of systems that will operate in cislunar space as well as on the surface of the Moon, we needed a new legal framework to accommodate the dynamic new opportunities that will now exist underneath the Artemis program. And that's where the Artemis Accords came from, that these are to be a series of bilateral agreements between NASA and international partners to enact activities under Artemis, taking advantages of the singular opportunity that we have with the Artemis program for new discoveries and innovations on the Moon and beyond. So an extraordinary new opportunity requires some extraordinary new legal frameworks and legal views. Now, while we say new, a great deal of what's in the Artemis Accords is grounded in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. As a matter of fact, we took a page from the Outer Space Treaty where it's a treaty of principles. And we think that's exactly the right way to go. Outer Space Treaty is over 50 years old now, doesn't look a day over 35 because it's a treaty of principles and isn't prescriptive and lists out a series of goals and objectives. And let me say, there's been a lot of excitement globally about the Artemis program and numerous countries that want to participate. And our hope, and this is something that was very important to the administrator, is that we leverage this opportunity to use it to ensure that if countries are going to partner with us on the Artemis program, that they share our principles, and principles that will create, as the slide says, a safe, peaceful, and prosperous future, not only for NASA and the international partner, but for the entire world in space. We need to lead by example to create this future that will be conducive for settlements and other activities, whether it's exploration, science, public, or private sector. The Accords will be bifurcated in a sense, that there will be the principles of the Accords that we'll go through here, and then there will be the actual substantive activity. The principles are intended to be the same for any partner that joins us in the Artemis program. However, of course, the activity will differ, whether that's a rover, an orbiter, or some other activity on the surface of the Moon or cislunar space. So what I thought I'd do today is take you through the principles of the Accords, which again will be uniform for any partner that joins us on this Artemis journey. And it begins with peaceful purposes, that it's its very heart. The Artemis Accords are intended to prevent conflict. For those of you who know me personally, I'm a big fan of science fiction, but I try to keep that sci-fi in my personal life and not in my professional, because if you look at science fiction, a lot of stories about conflict between countries in space or between the government and the private sector, et cetera. The Accords are a government-to-government agreement, so at the very least, we hope to prevent that country-to-country conflict, that we want to preserve peace in space, and that's why at the very heart of the Accords, as is the case in the Outer Space Treaty, peaceful purposes, that if you're going to join us on this Artemis journey, that partners will be required, that all the activities conducted under the Artemis program are for peaceful purposes. Next slide, please. Transparency. This is so important for any responsible space program and country, that we need to have transparency relative to what a country is doing, where it's doing, what its plans are, et cetera. And the US has always been committed to transparency. We at NASA try and maintain as transparent a process as possible. And again, countries that join us on this Artemis journey will also be asked to be transparent relative to what they're doing, their activities, because that's how we create, again, a safe and prosperous future in space for all of us. Next slide, please, Brett. Interoperability. It's important not only that people be able to talk to each other in space, but also that our systems and hardware can communicate. And this is a topic that I think is very much in keeping with the spirit of the Outer Space Treaty, although not necessarily required. But the more that we can have systems that are compatible, that can talk to each other, the easier it will be to achieve goals of like what we're talking today for space settlement, of maintaining peace if systems can talk to each other and they can be interoperable. Gateway is a good example of this, where we're putting up information relative to how to interface with Gateway publicly for the world to see. And again, for any international partners that join us in Artemis, we're going to strive to ensure that we create interoperable systems, because that will create an environment that's not only conducive to safety, but conducive to private sector growth. Will really establish an environment where we can all do more together. Next slide, please. Emergency assistance. So again, we believe that it's vital for any responsible space player to abide by the agreement on the rescue of astronauts and to commit to take all reasonable steps possible to render assistance to astronauts in distress. And this is what we're going to be asking for any country that joins us in the Artemis program. And here again, I think you see where interoperability is important, that a rescue operation will be safer, it'll be more efficient, and much more likely to succeed if we've got interoperable systems. So here's a good example of where the different principles of the Accords create synergy and feed into each other. Next slide, please. Registration of space objects. Registration is the very foundation upon which nearly everything else in terms of a legal framework is built upon. You can't avoid harmful interference. You can't get to issues of liability or other topics if you don't have an effective registration regime. And that's why partners who join us on the Artemis program will be asked to reinforce the critical nature of registration. And for anyone who isn't a member, that they need to join the registration convention as soon as possible, because again, registration is the foundation that everything else is built upon. If we don't get registration right, that creates a fundamental flaw that will echo throughout everything else we try and do. So a very important core principle here to the Artemis Accords and being a responsible player in space generally. Release of scientific data. This is something that's always been very important to NASA, that we release our scientific information publicly. Not every country does that. So while the Artemis Accords, I'm sure, aren't going to be signed immediately by every single country, we hope to lead by example and demonstrate our values. And that's why for ourselves and any country, again, that joins us in the Artemis journey, they're going to be asked to also publicly release their scientific data. It just creates more benefits for everyone, that if you release your scientific data publicly, then not only NASA and the international partner, but the entire world can go forward and enjoy the benefits of this Artemis journey. Protecting heritage, just like we do here on Earth, it's important to protect historic artifacts, historic sites in space. That's going to be true whether it's a human spaceflight activity, such as is pictured here, or robotic first is also very important for nations. So as we work with different partners on the Artemis program, we're going to ensure at an operational level that we respect the heritage sites, we respect our history, and don't cause any harm to particular historic sites and artifacts. Next slide, please. Space resources. This is another very important issue, that any campaign of exploration can't succeed if it has to take everything with it. I'm a native of Montana, and I can only imagine how unsuccessful the Lewis and Clark journey of discovery would have been if they had had to bring all of their food, all of their water, all of their air with them on that journey of exploration. So it's absolutely critical particularly if we're going to enjoy the benefits of space settlement, that we learn to live off the land. So the Artemis Accords describe that if we're going to move forward, and these are going to be partners with us on the Artemis program, a simple contention that you can extract and utilize resources, and that we can enjoy the fruits of our labor, and that any space resource extraction utilization should properly be conducted under the auspices of Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. Next slide, please. Deconfliction of activities. This is a great example of how the Artemis Accords stay within the bounds of the Outer Space Treaty, but take a step further relative to implementing the obligations of the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty says to prevent harmful interference. And here with the Artemis Accords, we're going to ask partners to take a modest step forward relative to how we would implement that avoidance of harmful interference. And what we describe in the Accords are safety zones. These are areas where, let's say you had a rover operating, or you had a surface habitat, the area around it where there could be the potential for harmful interference. So the first part of this goes back to both transparency and registration, that activity that's occurring, there needs to be notification that needs to be public. People need to know where you're operating. And then second, if there is the potential for harmful interference, that there should be coordination for anyone who enters this safety zone. The safety zone would be organic. It would very much depend on the particular activity and the particular geography of where you are. A safety zone in cislunar space would be very different than a safety zone on the surface of the moon. And the zone for a rover or a landing might be very different than that of a habitat or a power station. So we don't want to be too prescriptive and can't get into too many details, but it's very important that at the very least, to avoid harmful interference as required by the Outer Space Treaty, that we have notification and coordination to avoid harmful interference. And that's what we're going to be asking for partners who join us on this Artemis journey. Next slide, please. Finally, orbital debris and spacecraft disposal. We haven't done a great job globally in terms of orbital debris. It remains an absolutely critical issue that needs to be dealt with. And like so many other areas, we need to do better as we move forward to cislunar space and beyond. And that's why for countries signing the Artemis Accords, we'll be asking them to, at a minimum, have mitigation of debris plans, including the safe, timely, and efficient passivation and disposal of spacecraft at the end of their missions. Again, we need to be responsible citizens in space. So those are the principles of the Accords. We are moving forward with negotiations with a number of international partners and soliciting their feedback, getting their interest, receiving their ideas in terms of actual text and what this will look like. From that feedback, we will develop final text, and then we look forward to executing Artemis Accords agreements, particularly focused on nations that are conducting activities underneath the Artemis program. Again, these are intended to be operational agreements with countries that want to and are conducting activities under Artemis, and this describes how we'll go about conducting those activities in a safe, peaceful fashion that leads to a prosperous future that we all certainly hope includes space settlement. So with that, again, thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to being a part of the panel and answering questions.
That's great. That's great, Mike. And yeah, that's exactly what we're going to do now is move into our panel portion of the event, where we'll get questions from the group. And what I want to do at this point is to introduce our moderator for this portion of the program, who will introduce the other panelists. It's Beyond Earth co-founder Tony DeTora. Tony, as many of you might know, is Vice President of Government Relations for Link Global Inc., a fantastic new telecom satellite company. Previously, Tony was a senior professional staff for Chairman Congressman Dana Rohrabacher on the Committee for Science, Space, and Technology in the House. And Tony, as I mentioned, will be introducing the other two panelists. So with that, I will turn the program over to Mr. Tortora. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Steve. I'm pleased to be here. I'm looking forward to an exciting discussion. So the Artemis Accords lay out some important principles, which, as Mike pointed out, are grounded in the Outer Space Treaty. And while the Accords are focused on an effort of lunar exploration and expedition, they have longer-term implications for enabling communities beyond Earth. Peaceful purposes, transparency, release of scientific data, emergency assistance, these are principles that have been the bedrock of NASA's international space efforts for my entire lifetime. And I believe that new participants in space activities have been largely willing to meet those. But we're also highlighting other principles that are just now we're working to better define how to implement them. Deconfliction of activities and utilization of space resources. How we approach these now and into the future may well define how space activities progress and which activities are allowed or prohibited, which approaches lay the foundation for communities beyond Earth, and which ones keep our rockets chained to the ground. We will now have Mike Gold join a panel discussion with two Beyond Earth advisors, Laura Montgomery and Pete Worden. Both are interviewees for the Beyond Earth report that Tom discussed. Laura Montgomery teaches space law at Catholic University's Columbus School of Law. In her private practice, through Ground-Based Space Matters, she specializes in regulatory space law, with an emphasis on commercial space transportation and the outer space treaties. She provides expert opinion on the Commercial Space Launch Act and related regulatory issues. Laura also writes science fiction, some of which, not surprising, she calls legal science fiction. Welcome, Laura. And Simon Pete Worden, retired Brigadier General from the US Air Force, PhD, is the chairman of the Breakthrough Prize Foundation and executive director of the foundation's Breakthrough Initiatives. Previously, Pete was director of NASA Ames Research Center until his retirement in 2015. He has held positions in the United States Air Force and was research professor of astronomy at the University of Arizona. Welcome, Pete. Thank you all for joining us today. We've had a number of questions submitted ahead of time to the audience, from our audience. And if anyone has questions as the conversation proceeds, we have a Q&A tab, and you can also participate in the chat box. So, Laura, let's start with you. We just heard Mike tell us about the principles of the Artemis Accords. To what extent do you think the Accords can serve as a model for communities beyond Earth?
Well, I think the Accords are a fabulous start for NASA and its partners to implement the various principles of the Outer Space Treaty. And I think they are very well suited to government activities where the venture is defined in scope and NASA and its partners know what they want to accomplish. But I do think that translating it into a commercial perspective, which is perhaps where we're going to see the bulk of settlement activities, at least in the farther future, is, well, you know, they say the devil is in the details. And so I think there's a couple of the principles that I'd like to highlight that should probably merit further thought and analysis and possible modification going forward. So we have the transparency principle, which is of course great for a government. The citizenry appreciates transparency. You know, we've paid for that. We want to know what it is. And the sharing of scientific data, again, very good for government agencies to do. However, from a business perspective, I think there might be a little bit of a different attitude. You know, businesses have intellectual property interests that they need to protect. They have confidential business plans. I'm sure that if I were a miner, I wouldn't want to share the location of the platinum group minerals that I just found. So, so I think that full transparency and sharing of data is perhaps something that might have to be limited to the business and in the business environment for how things are going on now. I mean, it's the nature of commerce and competition that you don't want to give away advantages. So that's one thing I would look at more closely. And then if I may be a little heretical here, I think the interoperability provision is also something that we wouldn't want to mandate for the commercial sector, and certainly not in the early stages. You know, if you're familiar with the history of the keyboard, you know that there were a lot of different approaches taken to QWERTY. You know, you look at your keyboard, QWERT, etc. There were competitions. People would do speed contests and type, you know, using different keyboards, and one of them won. I think that if we were to mandate standards on the commercial sector at the outset, we might have engineers complaining 10 years later that those are bad standards. They were made up by people who hadn't gotten there yet. So let's not tie industry's hands. Let's let them evolve more organically, I would say. Lastly, I think the principle of recognizing the rights in extracted resources is a gem, and it's a wonderful one for the private sector, because as Mike said, we will be needing to use what we find in the land, and we will need to be able to have legal certainty about it and not worry that, well, yes, I just put in all this money and labor and 10 years in my garage, but now I can't use what I have finally produced because someone who shared neither my risks nor my labor is going to take it from me. So, you know, Congress passed that law in 2015, which recognizes US entities' rights in extracted resources. And I think it's very good that NASA is making sure that this is part of the accords and the agreements with international partners. So I think there's good things there. I think there's things in the accords that we'll have to look at closely and make sure that they translate properly to the commercial sector.
All right, well, thank you. And Pete, let's get your thoughts on the Accords serving as a model for communities beyond Earth.
Well, I think there's a rather significant global pent-up enthusiasm for the next step in the space program. You know, I've in the last few years have been very heavily involved internationally, and you know, truth be told, I'm an advisor to the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, so and I've been working hard to get them involved in space resources. And I think that I really commend Mike and NASA for the you know, doing the Artemis Accords and really making it a global effort. And I can't agree more with what Laura said, that it's, you know, it's very important to get the legal framework sort of set up. But I think that one of the key things, and I know that NASA is already working very hard on this, is that you know, a lot of our friends and allies around the world can get a lot of things through that we can't. You know, frankly, there's always controversy if a major power like the United States does something. And just to use the one example, Luxembourg, they've already gotten agreements with a good number of nations, which including China and Japan, and they're working with Russia on space resources, which I think is really the key issue. One of the things that I'd really like to emphasize is the idea of informal protocols, and that you know, these are extremely valuable. That if there can be fora set up, you know, by the Artemis Accords with key players, but primarily the commercial players, and but also governmental players, that can come up with some proposed protocols for things like non-interference and how to handle information security and so forth. You know, what's a zone of more or less you know, proprietary use of resources and so on. So I think this is a step that I really think is the next one now, is to try to get a series of global seminars where these can be worked out as you know, they're working relationships. So they, you know, eventually they may get put in formal agreements. But so my key thing is, I think the next step is really important here, is how to get you know, the kind of confidence that not agree that, you know, that you can use these resources and settle the moon, but that that you have sort of a working arrangement that you know, you're not going to be interfered with, and here's the kind of working relation, just like the international air traffic agreements and communications and so forth. So that would be my primary admonition is we need to carefully think of what the next step is.
Thank you. That's fascinating. So, Mike, I'd like to hear your response to that and what you've heard so far, and then we can move to the next section here.
Yeah, well, apologize for lack of conflict, but I'm in violent agreement with both of our panelists. So, I think Laura brings up some really good points. So I definitely have comments, though. Laura talks about how the Accords are intended for a government-to-government relationship. And there are aspects of the Accords that I think are good for the private sector and help establish precedent. On the other hand, as Laura pointed out, there are some that frankly run counter to what the private sector, would need and the way that they should act. The release of scientific data is an excellent example that's a terrific principle for NASA or any taxpayer-funded activity to abide by, but that in many ways could be anathema to private sector activity. Similar to transparency, et cetera. I think when it comes to the private sector, we have to focus hard on the registration, aspect of it, just so we know and can adopt things like safety zones. But I think we have to be very careful as we translate the Accords that many of these aspects, as Laura pointed out, are particular for government to government and should not be translated directly to the private sector. So I think that's a great point to make. That being said, as Laura had also mentioned, there are aspects of the Accords that I think help reinforce or at least establish a precedent that's good for the private sector. Space resources, again, being an example, at least we're stating that you can extract resources, enjoy the fruits of your labor, to the extent that the safety zones help reassure entities that if you make an investment on the surface of the moon or elsewhere in cislunar space, that there's a precedent, at least in government to government negotiation. And then I think we have to look at the private sector and say, what more can we do, or what fewer do we do? And that there's a whole additional conversation to have about that. So plenty left to do there for other entities, NASA not being a regulatory entity. And then relative to Pete's comments, again, I couldn't agree more that I participated when I was in the private sector with the Hague International Space Resources Working Group, which I think did some terrific work relative to looking at the issue of space resources. As a matter of fact, some of the work that was done in The Hague helped inform us relative to safety zones and what you see appears in the Accords. So that kind of activity where we can get together even on an informal basis and talk about these different ideas can be extremely helpful. And why it was called The Hague, many, if not most of the meetings occurred in Luxembourg. So Luxembourg had a huge role to play when those activities were done. And just as Pete said, countries like Luxembourg, United Arab Emirates, it's been so wonderful to see this proliferation of space agencies throughout the world. And they are really experiments in many ways where they can each go their own way in terms of how we deal with these issues, that the US can learn from it, much in the way that Laura was describing, like with interoperability. I go back to AC and DC, right? Alternating current, direct current. There again is another example where we want to be careful that you don't want to stifle innovation, and keep going. But it's been great to see what these different countries have been doing and to learn from it, and to have countries that have been in leadership roles in terms of policy, like Luxembourg. It helps us with the Accords, and I think helps us as a global society as we move forward to space settlement and additional aggressive exploration of the moon, Mars, and beyond.
Great. So one of the things that Laura mentioned earlier was the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015, which I thought was a mouthful. But the international reaction to that, which explicitly allowed US entities to engage in the exploitation of space resources, was the international community was questioning whether or not these provisions were in conflict with the Outer Space Treaty. Laura, do you think the Artemis Accords are consistent with the Outer Space Treaty, and especially with regard to these sorts of provisions and potentially ownership of space resources?
I do, and I think it's a position that the U.S. government has taken, and I know that Luxembourg itself looked at the question very carefully. They were sort of gung-ho to follow our lead, and then more cautious people said, wait, we've got to check it against the Outer Space Treaty, and they reached the same conclusion. So I do think that, we worry about Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, and it says that it prohibits national appropriation of outer space, including celestial bodies. So, the United States can't claim the moon. But when you read it, and lawyers are supposed to read the words, is it says it prohibits national appropriation. So it is silent on commercial appropriation. And when you look at property rights, they fall into two categories. One is extracted resources, whether you're taking fish from the sea or minerals from the ground, that's extracted resources. Then, of course, there's what we lawyers call real property, land. And that, I would argue, isn't, commercial ownership of land is okay under the Outer Space Treaties. So I think that when we look at these safety zones, it's probably a very small baby step in that direction. And I think it's a good one. I hope there are more to come. Mike and I went to the same law school, and I don't know if we had the same property rights, Professor Mike, but we were taught, going back to the Middle Ages, sorry about that, but we were taught that property rights are a bundle of sticks. There's a whole bunch of them that you can lease out, tease out, and you can rent your land, you can sell your land, or you can rent it for 1 year or 2 years, or you can rent just the mineral rights under it. There's all sorts of ways to slice and dice your property rights. And this safety zone looks to me like, if not the first stick, at least the first straw. So I think that it's consistent with the Outer Space Treaty, and it's probably a good first step towards eventual organic development of true property rights in outer space.
Gotcha. Continued violent agreement, Mike?
Yeah, afraid so. I can't go against the University of Pennsylvania alumnus.
Very good. So
the same we might have the same pro teacher, actually, Laura.
Possibly.
I'm still trying to.
That's someone else.
I don't understand Civ Pro.
Okay.
But
Mike, let's take up the alumni.
Yeah. So, relative to what, Laura says, I think she's absolutely correct. And again, it goes back to her previous statement about, the Artemis Accords being government to government, right? So certainly I cannot believe that there's anything in the Accords relative to space resources where, again, it's the simple contention that you can extract and utilize resources under the auspices of Article 2. I think that's implicitly, if not explicitly, contemplated by the treaty, and I think there would be very few nations that would argue against that, or at least such would, be my hope. There are other agreements and ideas that go further, and as Laura says, I think there's a very robust discussion that we should be having in terms of what we can do and how you should enable the private sector. But the Artemis Accords are very much a floor. And again, we're looking for that common agreement that will allow at least a baseline common ground for all of us to move forward on a government-to-government basis. But as we look at commercial activity, I think that's a different conversation and one that can go even further. Similar to the safety zone argument, I think Laura was absolutely correct that this is a modest step forward in terms of implementing our obligations underneath the Accords. And while we're asking other countries to sign the Accords, we're also encouraging them to go further. Again, this is a floor that they can look at different ideas that, will move ahead of just what the Accords say. And we're hoping that the Accords spur that kind of conversation internationally. So completely agree with her. And Tony, I want to say thank you to you too, that, shout out to you and Congressman Rohrabacher, who, were dealing with a lot of these issues before they were cool. So thank you for your leadership back in the day on legislation on these topics.
And again, Steve and his boss, George Brown, started this back in the 80s. So, but we did our part, let's say. So, Pete, I just want to touch base before we go to some audience questions. If a private entity with the means and ability wanted to build a community in space today, and what, if anything, would prevent them from doing so? And how might those policy impediments be different based on location, say the moon or Mars or just in free space? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, Tony, I think I missed the first part of your question.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
If
can you
an
hear me
entity-
now?
Yes, I've got you. So if an entity with the means and ability wanted to build a space community today, I think I've lost Pete. So, all right, we'll get back to that question. I'm
Yeah,
having
go ahead. I think I had a bad connection here. Can you
Okay,
repeat the
so
question?
if a private entity with the means and ability wanted to build a space community today, what would prevent them from doing so? And how might that policy impediments be different on the moon or Mars or in free space?
Yeah, I think one of the key things here, and one of the things that we need to address is human settlement, and what are the the rules of human settlement, even the governance, and this is a big open issue, and it's not really addressed in the Outer Space Treaty, and it's I think this is probably the big question. There are clearly ethical issues that if somebody's born on the moon or Mars, what is their status? The other one, which I really want to emphasize on the moon, isn't an issue, but I think Mars may be, is what happens if we find extant life? I think there's a very good chance that there's life underneath the surface on Mars, and this is quite an issue that is kind of it's the elephant in the room when you start looking at Martian settlement. It's kind of a potential challenge to all sides. In fact, there was an old sort of story that somebody told me that said, this is going to be a problem whether you're a left winger or a right winger. If you're a left winger, you're going to worry about us killing it. And if you're a right winger, you're worrying about it killing us. So, I think that, it's a good start. But the next key thing, I think, needs to be some thought is what are going to be the issues and governance and of a human settlement. Obviously, if it's a human settlement, it probably, at least by the Outer Space Treaty, could not be a national settlement, but it could certainly probably be some sort of global settlement. But then, what government are they responsible for? If somebody commits a crime, who defines the crime and who handles it? So that's going to be a big step. But I mean, I know it's going to take a while, but I think that's the thing we need to start.
Great. All right. I'd like to now ask Tom, who discussed the BE report earlier. He has some questions from our audience that we'd like to share with you. And
Yeah.
get your feedback. There we go.
Thanks, Tony. Can you hear me?
Yep. Crystal.
First, it's been brought to our attention that the chat function is not enabled, so feel free to drop a question into the Q&A. So our first question deals with property rights, and it says, until we have the ability to improve a piece of, quote, land and own it / secure finance against it, progress in space will be limited. What do the Artemis Accords do to enable this idea of owning and securitizing property in space?
So again, I think the Accords establish a floor. They're a modest step forward in two areas, both of which we've discussed: space resources, where the Accords stand for, again, common sense proposition that you can extract and utilize resources, you can gain from the fruits of your labor, and then the safety zones, that you can operate in space without fear of harmful interference, as is required by the Outer Space Treaty. Again, as Laura pointed out, these are modest steps forward. Really, I don't know how you would go about avoiding harmful interference without the idea of a safety zone. And just to provide a little bit more detail there, when we say safety zone, again, we're looking at notification in terms of what you're doing and coordination to avoid harmful interference, both of which are required by the Outer Space Treaty. I don't know how you would do it without it. So I think that's helpful for where people are trying to head, but it's the beginning, not the ending of that conversation.
Great. Another question.
Or, yes.
This
Okay,
question
sorry.
also. Thanks, Tony. Mike, what would you say is the most important policy change that could enable human communities beyond Earth as quickly as possible?
So can I say Artemis Accords? Selfish.
Besides the Artemis Accords.
Besides the Artemis Accords. You know, I really think, and again, forgive me as a recovering procurement attorney, but in many ways, the policy that we need to see change and what has been changing and what's led to the dynamic and exciting world of commercial space and the growth of commercial space that we've seen is procurement policy. I go back to the COTS program, which in my mind may have been, you know, the most innovative and best money, you know, that we've spent at NASA. That from that, which, and again, I'm going to be vague in terms of numbers, right? But you know, I think it was about $1 billion or so investment. We got 2 rockets, you know, both of which have delivered cargo to the ISS, and 2 capsules, both of which have delivered cargo to the ISS. And the reason that program was so successful is that we looked on a fixed price basis, that we leveraged Space Act agreements at first, which kept everything, you know, very simple in terms of paperwork. And we weren't prescriptive in terms of how to accomplish what the government wanted. We just said what the government wanted to accomplish. And therefore, we were able to leverage the creativity, the innovation, and the efficiency of the private sector to move forward. And what we got from that was not only meeting NASA's needs in an innovative and affordable fashion, but we got a whole new industry back in the United States. I mean, we had basically lost commercial space flight, you know, a long time ago to European competition, to the Russians, even China back in the day. And due to innovative procurement policy, we were able to leverage the power of the purse to create this whole new dynamic system and environment. And I think that's something that, you know, can benefit both traditional players as well as new entrants and, you know, all of the companies alike. So I think it's that attitude, that change in policy that can really drive innovations that will create capabilities that candidly we can't even imagine right now, and will help drive not only NASA and the US, but the world into this exciting future of settlement that we'd all like to see.
All right, thank you. So Tom, what else do we have from the audience there?
Sure. This question is for Laura Montgomery. Well, I only directed towards her because of her past experience at the FAA, and the questioner refers to the FAA. Maneuvering or changing orbits to avoid interference with other spacecraft consumes fuel and thereby reduces the life of the spacecraft. If spacecraft operators are unwilling to move to ensure clearance, should governments have authority similar to FAA airworthiness directives to compel spacecraft operators to maneuver to avoid interference?
So the FAA does not actually have authority on orbit at the moment, and I guess the question is, should it, akin to its air traffic authority over aircraft in flight. And my own personal opinion is that we probably don't need that just yet. The Space Data Association on the Isle of Man is a collection of satellite operators who coordinate with each other and let each other know when they're getting too close and say, hey, you got to move, no, you got to move, and work it out. And they are closely tied in with the US Space Command entity that looks at all of the data. And sometimes Space Command says, you two might want to know that you're getting within bad probabilities of each other. So I think that right now there is a lot of voluntary coordination on that, and I think we can rely on operators' self-interest to avoid each other. So I I lean toward that side. Conversely, there are those who say, well, they're not going to move if they don't have to because it's so expensive, going to the questioner's point about fuel. But it is a hot policy debate right now, and it has been since I was at the FAA. The FAA, I don't know if it's still interested, but was very interested at the time in acquiring authority on orbit in order to address this problem. I think that those types of discussions have led industry to hope that the FAA will take care of it for them and get a bit of a subsidy there, that someone else will do all the work rather than them. But it's a good policy question and a good debate, and we'll see what happens.
Well, at what point, you said, Laura, at some point it may become necessary. Do you have any idea what that point might be?
Well, if yeah, I think it's going to be one of those inflection points where industry figures out, oh, hey, we know how to get our junk out of orbit. I have a dead satellite here, and I can put it in the ocean. I can have it burn up and put it in the ocean safely. And once they have the ability to do that, they might then have an incentive from the liability perspective to do that.
Okay.
And so perhaps there will be a self-cleansing, or conversely, they won't. And it might get so bad that the decision is made in Congress and even with industry's consent and desire that perhaps there needs to be a greater governmental hand in making this happen, in cleaning up orbital debris.
Okay. All right, Tom, I think we have time for another one or two questions.
Certainly, yeah, we have many. Perhaps Pete Worden might want to give his opinion on this. What can be done to persuade nations that are not partners of the Artemis Accords to either join the Artemis Accords or pursue principles similar to the Artemis Accords? And specifically, the questioner asks, when other nations pursue independent ambitions on the moon and Mars that come into conflict with the US and its allies over the use and extraction of resources, what can be done to resolve those conflicts?
Well, that's a very, very good question, and I think again that probably the first approach is what Laura suggested, is like the space communications folks, that there are more informal relations that and agreements that eventually become more formalized. I mean, a good example is the World Radio Conference. That is it's a very old and distinguished organization, and it doesn't have a lot of enforcement capability other than that governments will have signed on to agreeing by it. So I think again that where I would see the Artemis Accords migrating into the basis of maybe an informal global organization, eventually a more formal agreement, and they would set up some of these that agreements to say that, okay, we have a disagreement over this, that, or the other thing, and can then, even if they're not signed on to the Artemis Accords, I think it's really the start of that. And second, I guess I have to say, in a sense, I've always been an advocate for the Space Force. So, as a retired Air Force guy, I wish I was still on active duty for that. But I think there is ultimately a role for some sort of national and international security. And I think that's going to be necessary to true commercial development of the solar system. If you look carefully at the U.S. Constitution, it sort of makes it pretty clear there's really two kinds of military forces. One of those is a warfighting force, which it called the War Department, and the other one is I'll call it an economic surety force, which is the Department of the Navy. And I see, in some sense, this becomes a security issue that will evolve in time if there are challenges that it's something where a coalition can end up enforcing things. Now, obviously, you have to be careful so it doesn't lead to conflict. that's why I think that the directions the United States is taking right now with the Artemis Accords and with NASA's leadership in particularly the moon, but at the same time that starting to have discussions about what's the security underpinning of this. And I would always argue that the Space Force really should focus on beyond Earth. So I think this is a big topic, but yes, ultimately there's probably going to be necessity for at least the capability to enforce things.
Gotcha. So Mike, one of the things with the announcement of the Artemis Accords about a month ago, the only sort of negative response I saw was from Russia about that. And I know you're also not enabled to speak with China about maybe joining it or doing any sort of work together with NASA. Maybe you could address those countries specifically, or anybody else that there's perhaps a greater challenge engaging in these things.
So Tony, as you know, I'm a recovering attorney and still recovering. And part of being an attorney is belief in precedent, that precedent's important. And even for nations that don't sign the accords, be it China, Russia, or anyone else, it's so important that we lead by example. And if the US and its partner nations register, if we respect safety zones, we release our scientific information publicly, we have a soft power influence then, even on the nations that don't. We have shown what responsible space actors look like. And I believe that has an influence, and it's a non-trivial one. So even for nations that don't sign the accords, I think if we stick to our values, support the rule of law, act in a transparent fashion, that has an influence not only on the signatory nations, but on the entire world.
Laura, do you
Yeah,
agree?
Mike, if I could add, I think that's where it's important. It's an opportunity for our partners to get some agreements that are difficult for us. And I mean, that's, as I noted, Luxembourg at least has already signed agreements with negotiating one with Russia about space resources. And granted, it's always a controversy, but I think that sometimes a partner can do something that we can't, and that's a real advantage of having these global partners.
Gotcha. And Laura, so laying that international framework, it becomes a standard. Would you agree with that approach? That
Eventually, there's something called customary international law, and if states habitually practice a certain thing and they do it for a very long period of time, it can become customary international law. And so this would be the first floor of that.
excellent. So laying the foundation for the future of communities beyond Earth. So Tom, what else have you got for us?
We've got one more question, and it's kind of a fun one. It's for each of the panelists. So when do each of you predict we will see the first self-sustaining community beyond Earth? When will we settle space? Tony, take it away, whoever wants to go first.
All right, Laura, let's start with you.
The number 50 years from now popped into my head. I don't know from where. So I'll go with that. I think that it'll allow time for certain technical, legal, and financial issues to be resolved. And I think it will be a private sector community that will be the first one in terms of a sustainable place that you don't leave and leave deserted.
All right, Mike.
My answer, Tony, would be not soon enough. That the faster we can get this done and the more that we can enjoy the benefits of sustainable space settlement, the better off life will be on Earth for all of us. That we go to space to improve life here on Earth. So I hope that we can do it as quickly as possible. And I hate to quote a New York Yankee. I know you'll like that, but it's tough to make predictions, particularly about the future. So I won't go with the date, but I'll say that we need to proceed with all alacrity so that we go to space and can enjoy those benefits here on the planet.
Great. And Pete.
Okay, I'm not an attorney, so I'll make a prediction. I'm an astronomer by background. I think it's going to happen this decade. I know there are groups already of high net worth people in Silicon Valley and elsewhere that are planning settlements. That we had when I was still at Ames about 6 years ago, we had a workshop that had, including the Google co-founders and some other high net worth people. The conclusion was in the 2020s, we could set up a settlement for a few billion US, which is, and these people are quite serious about it. So is somebody who works for a billionaire who's already dedicated hundreds of millions to go into the stars, I think it'll be fairly straightforward to get a settlement set up. So I'd say in the 2020s, by the end of this decade, you'll have the first children born on another world.
All
I
right.
like you to the best.
All right.
Well, I'm
so
getting old. I need to see it before I have to leave.
All right. I'd like to thank Mike and Laura and Pete for joining us today. I'd like to bring Steve back in now. So Steve, I think our panel has given us some tremendous insights and a lot to think about as we move forward. And Steve is going to bring us home.
Yeah, and all I could say with that final round of predictions is like, holy cow. And, Mike, I love your answer. Laura, I probably would have put myself in your camp, and certainly Pete Worden is really making our eyes open to the potential. And we know that the potential is there. We know that people, as you mentioned, the high value folks are really working this issue. And even as we do this, even as that plans are being developed and put together, and we want to, there is a clear and a clear role for in the policy community to be addressing these issues. I think one of the takeaways for me from this conversation is that whereas we are very clear about what are the upcoming issues, what are the challenges that are like 5 or 10 years on the horizon, especially in the context of the Artemis project and getting back to the moon, we kind of have a handle on that. But as soon as we start getting out a little bit ahead of that horizon, it gets very the policy framework is really not there, and that's what the Beyond Earth initiative is really all about. So thank you all to our panels. And at the beginning of this program, I told you a story about the Space Settlement Act of 1988, and it was put forth by House Democrat George Brown. I do want to note that when Tony was working for Dana Rohrabacher, he drafted a revised version of that 1988 bill called the Space Exploration Development and Settlement Act of 2015. And so, though Tony and we come from opposite ends of the aisle, we are unified in a bipartisan cause for Beyond Earth. And as I said, our mission is to develop the policy framework to enable and encourage efforts to create new branches of civilization beyond and throughout the solar system. And certainly, if this goal appeals to you, we invite you to join us. Join us as lawyers and policy experts. Join us as partners, sponsors, and volunteers. Join us as future stakeholders who will build the infrastructure that will allow humankind to make new homes in space. Go to beyondearth.org and contact us and pledge your support. Let us know what you're thinking and how you'd like to participate. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And thank you very much for joining us today. And we look forward to hearing from those of you wishing to join our movement. So thank you very much. And I want to also give a shout out to Brett Jones, who has seamlessly guided us through on the technical side of things. And thanks to the team, and have a great week, everyone. Thank you.